What's really good, everybody? This is Nathan Allebach, and welcome to the podcast where we get into people's stories and go down a bunch of rabbit holes about what's really good in the world. Today's guest is Jared Byas. Jared is a former professor and the current co-host of the Bible for Normal People podcast, along with Pete Enns, whom he also co-wrote the book Genesis for Normal People with a few years back. They're just all about normal people like us, you know? I met Jared in 2010 at this community project he was collaborating on that I helped book some songwriters for, and afterward I became a big fan of his, just his blogging and social media presence in general. He's someone who's always innovating and dipping his hands in different cool projects, so it was great getting to sit down with him here. We got a bit into his personal story and the work he's doing with his and Pete's podcast. We touched on topics of belief, privilege, labeling, linguistics, postmodernism, and the book he's in the process of writing about truth. Jared is one of the most nuanced thinkers I know, so I'm always interested to hear how he's navigating the tension between spaces, whether they be belief and non-belief or progressivism and conservatism. I just really believe that having people like him who are consciously aware of this is so important in how we improve our conversations about the issues that matter. And I hope you share some of that sentiment and enjoy our conversation. Now let's get into what's really good. Jared Byas, thanks for coming on the podcast.
You're very welcome.
So I'll have given the people a little bit about yourself before all of this, but just for the sake of your story and how you wish to be perceived, do you want to give a little bit about like how you got into what you do and just a little bit of your background?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's like such a cynical social media thing to say.
Right.
Like,
I got to get your soundbite.
How you whenever you're thinking of others perceiving you, how would you want that to look?
Which is like all of podcasting. This is all we're putting out how we want to be perceived.
Yeah, but you don't understand the magic of it is you don't name that. Right?
It's true.
Once you name the reality,
I'm breaking the fourth wall.
Exactly. You're pulling the rug out from under us. So, yeah. How do I want to be perceived? I don't know. I just I think what I'm most passionate about is conversation and connection, and all the taboo ways in which we sort of interfere with that. I think, you know, I was just thinking about this this morning because I was doing something else with a podcast about how truth can get in the way of connection, and it's so interesting because we think it's like truth is the way to connection with other people, but oftentimes it's like an idol or kind of gets in the way. So, that, kind of breaking down the barriers of connection and. Yeah, so I think that I'm passionate about being able to be in relationship with people in all different ways. So,
right. Yeah, it's interesting just because I know a lot of the stuff that you're involved in, the stuff that we've talked about in the past, it revolves around, like you mentioned, the communicative arts and also spirituality and questions of philosophy and theology. So when you kind of get into the nitty-gritty of a lot of that, I think some people check themselves at the door when they hear like certain terms, and they lose interest because of the labeling. Like they lose interest because they either have assumptions or have had assumptions or experiences that either deter them away from like these ways that we communicate or something of that nature. So I know like that's the heart of a lot of what you get into. So it's interesting to think about like how you are putting yourself out there, but like you kind of do have to think about like how you're being perceived and how you're perceiving others with these
absolutely.
topics.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, because I think that's exactly right. I think, sometimes people won't listen to you. I mean, it's just kind of the world we live in. Like if you get pegged with a certain label, you don't have an audience with them anymore. And it's just, for me, I care more about being able to connect with someone than being able to accurately label myself. So.
Yeah. So like jumping into just kind of what I know about you and maybe what some of the audience does or doesn't know about you. Like we grew up in similar communities from like a geographical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a pretty conservative area, like both politically and theologically. So growing up for you, kind of whenever you hit that arc to your story, I guess, where you started to pique different interests and get into different modes of being and thought, like what has it been like for you the past several years or decades and kind of balancing that tension out where you come from one label and now you're kind of slapping on another label and now you're trying to navigate in between all these things that people are pegging on you. Mm-hmm. Like what's that tension been like?
Yeah, I think one thing I would say is my personality. I'm an 8 on the Enneagram, so it helps in that way because I just don't like labels in general. Because I guess it's just my personality. I'm like, don't label me.
Yeah,
I'm one of a kind. So that actually helps because I don't get a lot of. I don't think my ego is fed. I don't get a lot of sense of belonging or connection from participating in labels. So that helps. I think a lot of people, that brings them a lot of comfort and it helps them feel like they belong and it brings them some confidence that they're not alone. And that's great. But I think that just how I was built it's not that important to me.
Yeah.
So that helps because then I can navigate different arenas, and I'm extremely curious. So I'm a very curious person. So I think of it as I can navigate all different kinds of communities because I'm really interested in understanding people and less interested in being understood. I think that's important in some situations, but my journey is much more about understanding. And so it wasn't too hard, I don't think. I think I'd naturally shy away from labeling my thought process as like, now I'm this and now I'm that.
Right.
So that's helped, although people do want to paint you in that corner. Like, no, just tell me, are you a Calvinist or not? Like, are you a Christian or not? And I get that because it helps people to feel what they're really saying is, I want to make sure I'm in, and I use you as a foil for that. So if you identify as in or out, it helps me understand whether I'm in or out. And I understand that. I respect it. I just resist it.
It's interesting because I think a lot of what people mean when they get into that sort of box creating mindset is that so many of the issues that we see today are like they revolve around policy issues and they revolve around social issues and debates between one party and another party. So when they see one person like espousing certain rhetoric toward like one party's belief system, then that's sort of the area that they want to paint you in totality within. So what, like when it comes to actually, like, so you're a very nuanced guy. So like you're always trying to bring the nuance into the conversation. So how do you balance being a nuanced and curious person amidst these different tribal identities while at the same time knowing like when to put your foot down, like when to stand for like what you believe is just and right and not in a way that is neglecting or isolating or putting down the other in your life? Yeah,
it's interesting. I would say I'm not a master of that for sure, but it's interesting that when you are really about understanding someone, how much more tolerant they are of your differences. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I haven't really had to compromise that in a lot of ways. Wow. Like if I spend, it's kind of like a, I don't know, 7 out of 10 ratio. Like if I spend 70% of my time just trying to understand you and being curious and connecting and saying, I totally get it. I understand why you would think that. Yeah. That 30% where I'm like, that's wonderful. I would just think of it differently. Here, let me explain a little bit how I would see it differently. Then that goes a long ways. Yeah. So that's like that 30%. And so I think it's an investment in a relationship, an investment in a genuine way. Like I'm not investing 70% of my time understanding you just so I get my 30%. Right. It's just, I genuinely want to know where you stand. I want to understand the whole compendium and how you fit and how does that connect with all these other things. And then at the end, I've just found that people are really receptive when I say, well, yeah, I just disagree and I'm going to behave in this way rather than that way. Another thing, I don't know if this connects at all, but I also think we just make too much of belief
Right.
as like a mental assent. And it's like, it's funny to me because it's like, it's not real.
Yeah.
Like, if you took a video camera of people who disagree on these things and you just followed them around, like their life largely would look pretty similar.
Yeah.
And that was really important for me when I realized that, like, because I had certain fundamental beliefs and then I switched and I actively thought like, okay, if I switch this belief about hell or something like that, like, how is that actually going to change my life?
Right.
And it frankly, it didn't.
Yeah, it's so abstract. Like, I think about this all the time with my friends who I do disagree with vehemently about whatever issue, how when you're in the same room as them, I think it comes down on one end to the sort of philosophical question of the whole thing where it's like, how do our beliefs, like, guide, the ethical framework of the world?
Right.
Like what sort of beliefs do we want to, like, progress our culture with? And those are questions that, they're worth asking. They're worth talking about within these conversations. But when it comes down to a lot of the opinions, like the opinions within the beliefs, where it's like, okay, we both maybe believe there's a God, or maybe we both believe there isn't a God. And that's the sort of broader framework that we can look at. But then when you get to the nitty-gritty of just, do I believe this happened literally? Or do I believe this, like, one passage of this holy text is a very defining one for my belief code? Like, these are the things that, they become much more abstract when you deal with the day-to-day grind of just going to work and being with your family and getting to know your friends. Like, they're not as in your face, I guess, unless they become weaponized politically. Right. So, like, they have the potential, I guess, if someone extracts it.
Yeah, but then they become something else.
Right. Exactly.
They're not just beliefs at that point. And so that, I mean, I think the only thing I would challenge is even those, you talked about we both believe in God or don't. For me, what do we mean when we say we believe something? I think I would challenge that idea, because in the last 300 years, what we've come to mean, and I think we're too obsessed with this idea, is I click it off in my mind and say, I believe that.
Right.
That's literally what it means.
Yeah.
I think about it and I say, I believe that.
Yeah.
I don't know what the value of that is. I don't know, like, could belief also mean something else? Like, and this is where I'm big on, some people say, I used to, probably 5 to 7 years ago, I said it quite a bit, but someone would say, like, well, what do you believe about this? And I would actually say, I don't know. You have to ask my friends and you have to ask my family. Like, they will tell you, like, way more accurately what I believe. I can tell you what I wish I believed or what I think I believe or what I want to believe.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the people who see me interacting with the world every day are going to be able to tell you better what I actually believe.
Yeah. It's like how you're living. Because these beliefs, they become, they become compartmentalized in the back of your head, like a padded answer to something that doesn't really ever reach the surface of anything. And it's interesting, too, how, like, even just the definitions of saying I believe in God or I don't believe in God, if that's like the sort of micro example we're working with, even that, like the word belief, like you mentioned, the way we define it, there's also people who define it as I know. Like, people equate belief with knowing, which is a super weird thing because it's like it's in the definition, I feel like, of belief. It's like it's sort of like the word faith. Like when someone says, like, I have faith that this will happen, it's like I have hope this will happen. I believe this will happen. These are things that you are putting some kind of, like, just in the name of the definition, it seems like you're putting a chance in there that this is not possible.
That's
like,
right. It's risk.
There's risk that it may not happen, but a lot of people don't live their lives to that, like, with the meaning of it. You know what I mean?
Right.
They live as if it is a fact, as if it is absolute, as if it is, untouchable almost. When you get into these, not just religious, like politically, like we're saying, like it translates into people's entire, it's like almost like a virus. Like when you start fundamentally with somewhere, like if your starting point is God, or your starting point is the Democratic Party, or whatever, like name an issue, like a big issue that like helps create the underbelly of someone's moral framework. When you start there with this is the way it is, that's what I think creates this weird toxic environment where people are unable then to allow this space for curiosity and wanting to understand why someone believes what they believe, because then it's just about there's just a right and there's a wrong. There's not this open space for curiosity and the what ifs and what do you believe about.
Are you saying absolutes create toxicity? Is that what you're saying? Did I just hear you say that?
Did this just become a postmodern podcast? Yeah. How many podcasts have been done where it's just two people going off about like relative truth and absolute truth? Yeah. Well, it is interesting. It is interesting that way because it becomes. I think a lot of what you're teetering on here does come down to the fundamental question too of free will, which is something that I've been coming back to a lot. Where for myself, that was a big tipping point in how I viewed other people's rhetoric and where they were coming from on any given issue. Whereas before, I kind of always believed, okay, yeah, like temperament has something to do with it. You know, your life experiences have something to do with it. These are abstract notions I held in my head. But when I really started piecing together, like, no, if I was born in this other country or this other region, I would believe like whatever it would be the common held belief in that region. And when you get to that point, you start to think, how much does the free will of my own beliefs come into play when I am interacting with somebody else here? Because like we're on just different cognitive levels of each thing that we believe. So like how do you even define truth in that way? Like where do you start?
Yeah, well, one thing I would, again, you talked about me as being nuanced. I wouldn't normally do this, but since it's your podcast and not mine, I'm going to just be
honored.
super nuanced. I would just even challenge you said, if I were in this country, I would believe. So you just made an absolute statement.
Right, I would probably.
Right,
I should have said.
And I think that's the point, though, is that we have to it is like the more we learn about the world, the more we understand that almost everything is probabilistic.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's important because when we're not clear about that, I think that's where a lot of arguments come from. Because I can just imagine you saying that to someone, maybe who has a different framework, and they'd be like, no, well, I have an example of someone who did grow up in this,
right,
and they came out of it, and so you're wrong, and now like
it just shuts the whole thing down.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So when you make it probabilistic, it's helpful because it allows for that shifting and the exceptions, but we're talking percentages here, like 90% chance. I mean, all of our life is probabilistic in that way.
That's the weird thing about talking in nuance in general, because to a certain degree, when you're so nuanced and even little statements like that, you lose a lot of the punch in what you're trying to say.
That's right.
And when you lose the punch, you lose your audience, you lose your book deal, you lose all these...
Welcome to the state of American media right now. You just nailed it.
Yeah, it's so... I find myself doing this all the time on Twitter. Like, I'll be on Twitter, and I'll have an idea, like the example that we just went back and forth on, and I'll go to tweet it, and I start to, pick it apart and try to add nuance to it. And before I know it, the tweet isn't saying anything, and no one is going to care. It's not going to appease to anybody. Yeah. It's such a difficult thing to navigate. It's hard to know, I think, for people who try to live more in that mindset of looking at things carefully and wording things carefully. It's hard for people who do that to also then plant your feet down and know how to go about being public about what you believe and like how strongly you feel about those things.
Well, I think if you keep in mind just knowing that you're trying to do different things, not every communicative act is doing the same thing. Like, I'm trying to get to the accuracy of a statement, and I'm with the person who, which is why I said I would nitpick with you on that.
Right.
Because I have a podcast for normal people. I would never do that.
Literally for normal.
Yeah, that's what it's called. So, like, I would never do that because that's not the purpose of that podcast.
Right.
And so I have to be always aware in that public sense of my communication acts. Like, what am I trying to do here?
Yeah.
Is it to evoke emotion? If it is, then I may not nuance something. And then for the people who are, sticklers, they'll come at me and then we'll have a nuanced conversation.
Yeah.
So it's just knowing it, and it's always a risk. Like, you're always, I remember it's Derrida or Deleuze, but I was talking about, like, the truth is always overseeping. It's always bigger than the thing you're trying to do. And you just have to accept that. And so we're always kind of cookie cutter-ing reality. And there's always leftovers on the outside. You just have to, if you're intentional and aware of that, you can kind of choose what the leftovers are.
Yeah.
So, I would just say, it's not like right or wrong. It's just being aware of what you're trying to communicate and then choosing the right medium for that.
Right. So one of the issues that I've been dealing with recently? Because I'm a long-time podcast listener and just someone who I love engaging in this medium, particularly like around different influences of mine, like from not far right and not far left, but sort of like moderately left and moderately right, like from the center-ish, I would say. And the past 7 or so years of kind of going back and forth, like as the pendulum kind of swings, depending on where you're at in life, you know, going back and forth on that, one of the patterns I pick up on that, I feel like nowadays especially, it's becoming more and more talked about. It's almost to a cliche at this point, where people talk about echo chambers and they talk about how do you deal with like your tribalism? You know, it's like these are buzzwords now in like the age of Trump and fake news and like all the media polarization going on. So I'm interested to know from your perspective and your experience podcasting, like you're in this world of whatever you want to call it, like partially these curious, nuanced people who are trying to expand their worldview. And then you have also people who I think are more in that progressive ideology, or like more like they've been disenfranchised in some way by fundamentalism or Christianity in some capacity. So how do you, like in the process of the past like year or so of you guys doing the podcast, like how do you manage not just like falling back into repeating same content and like putting out the same stuff and like what you know people just want to hear every week? Because obviously you want to give them what they need, like you're feeding them a product, so there's like that part of it which you can't just give them what they don't want, obviously. But how do you like navigate not just allowing yourself to become the thing that you hate, almost like just becoming like another team, like another tribe,
right?
You know, have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think about, I'm a little obsessive about thinking about things. So, yeah, I'm thinking, how do we do that intentionally one thing is we are committed to being constructive, and that's important because I think the trope or the thing we can fall back into is being identified by what we're against.
Right.
When a lot of people come out of like a more fundamentalist religion, I think they can just have a lot of anger, and there's a time and space for that, and we do not want to minimize that. But we don't want to be that space necessarily. We want to be a safe place for people who are there, but we're personally not going to engage in that as much. So I think that's important that we always have an eye toward constructivism. Like what are the steps forward? What does faith look like beyond this, rather than still being trapped, whether it's positive or negative, by sort of fundamentalism. Whether you're reacting against it or anything, you're still revolving around it. And so keeping an eye on that helps us get more creative and imaginative in that way. And I think the product we're selling is actually not an ideology, but a methodology. And I think that helps as well, so that we're not, for me at least, like I'm interested in bringing tools of critical thought and helping people take that next step, whatever that looks like.
Right.
And so we're not really selling a product as much as a process, I guess, and that helps.
Yeah, it's interesting just to think about. I guess Richard Rohr puts it this way. A lot of people in this sphere put it the way of there's the sort of stages where you go through constructing your ego identity beliefs, and then you go through the deconstruction process and then the reconstructing process. So it's interesting to, like, what kind of feedback are you getting from, I guess, like the fringes or like outside of what you're producing? So like on both ends, like do you get feedback from like more conservative minded individuals who like are getting something from this podcast, and then also the more deconstructionists? How's that been like navigating like the different?
So are you thinking of people who would say they enjoy the podcast from the different angles?
Both.
Or okay.
I guess I'm saying yes, like from an enjoy perspective. I just mean like I'm interested to know like what people are saying in feedback to this, like from outside of it a little bit. You know what I mean? Like that's what I'm always interested in. Like I kind of, since I started doing my podcast, I've been going out of my way to find my critics, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like I'm trying to see like what it's lacking. Obviously, like you want to know that stuff, but then I also want to make sure I'm actively seeking out people who I know wouldn't normally listen to me in this capacity. Like there's a couple people that I can think of off the top of my head off Twitter that have reached out to me. We've talked a bit about the podcast, and the type of content that I'm putting out would be definitely left of center, like, generally speaking. So there's been a few people who are not of that, like they don't listen to that type of content. So I'm like always going to them for feedback and like what they feel like I could have done better, or like what they're enjoying from it? Like what kind of what are some of the bridges, I guess I could say, that you've been building that you feel that have really done that for those fringe people that listen?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Well, a lot of my family would be different than me, and that's helpful because I feel like every podcast I'm very aware of, like, I'm not going to say anything that's just going to score points with the people who agree with me at the expense of my family.
Right, yeah.
I don't know, I just think that's a jerk thing to do. So I'm always mindful of that. And so I have really good friends who are on a different spectrum. So I think I have like personas. I have like maybe 3 or 4 personas that are represented by like a close friend who would be really fundamentalist, my family. And I actually kind of keep those in mind every podcast of like, what would they think about that? What would they think about that? What would they think about that? And in a way that, again, like I talked about earlier, it's not that they would disagree with me. It's just that they wouldn't get their hackles up because I was like emotionally dismissive or a jerk. It's more about the posture than the content.
Yeah.
So I think, we can disagree and that's fine. And people could even be angry at it, but they'd be angry at our difference and not angry at me.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I think is, we have people who, you can't get away from the critics who were just like, 1 star on Apple review because you're just spouting leftist blah blah blah.
Right.
It's like, okay, that's fine. Whatever. It's
There's
like
always gonna be that.
another fake news source or whatever. So, and the same on the same for people on the progressive side. Sometimes you just can never be progressive enough, and you can never be conservative enough. And I'm not worried about those people. I'm worried about the people who are really thoughtful and can critique what we're doing in ways that I'm like, oh yeah, that's legit. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Can you expand a little bit? I'm interested to know more just on this whole topic of not becoming the sort of thing that you hate, which is kind of like I think what a lot of this is centered around. It's like you're navigating new ways to talk about the issues that matter. Like post something, like post a certain belief or post certain community way of life, whatever. And now you don't want to slide into some area where you're just as hateful or spiteful or deconstructing negativity constantly. So what are some of the ways you mentioned being curious? Like what are some of the other ways that you can tangibly say for other people who would either be looking to become more public, whether it's through a podcast or posting on social media or whatever? Like, what are some ways that, or tools, I should say, that people could use to not become that thing while also standing to their convictions?
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 things come to mind real quick. I'll try to say them before I forget them. One is always work on yourself. Like, check your ego. I mean, there's something really powerful about it feeds a need to identify with something that we're not, right? So I think that's really, important is always be working on yourself and checking your ego. And then the second thing would be do your homework. I think it's just so much easier it's easier to critique things.
Yeah.
It just is. So coming from a background of philosophy, that's like I was trained to critique things. It just is easier because all you're doing is pointing out what's wrong with things. Yeah. And it's just an easier practice. So I always joke that I had a blog that was, I pretty prolific on for a while, like from like 2008 to 2011 or 12 or 13 or something like that. And the last blog post I ever said was, okay, I've committed myself now to only like writing constructively. Like I'm done with the deconstructive phase. And 5 years later, I haven't done one post past that. Wow. Because it's just hard. Yeah. Like, whoa, okay, now I have to recreate a world. And for me, it's this bigger concept of I want to respect, and I respect creators, people who create things in the world. Whether I agree with them or not, it's freaking hard to do, to create beautiful things that resonate with people and that resonate as true and resonate as beautiful. And it's just hard. Yeah. So I want to respect that. So anyway, I think doing your homework, which takes time, it just takes a long time. Like I'm 10 years into this process, and I'm just now kind of coming out with like a coherent, okay, I think that's kind of how I want to construct things. Right. And then secondly, checking that ego, because it's a cheap win. I mean, it's just a cheap win to do that. So. Yeah.
I think that's a pretty common thread from people I've talked to who have asked the same question, where people always come back to creating. It's like you need to create something. Like it can't all be tearing down and deconstructing. Like you have to learn to build something out of this nothingness that now you have been left with whatever belief or structure that you left behind. So, I mean, I'm interested to know a little bit more on like what you think about, like a lot of what you were just saying there, how like there are those who just deconstruct and just critique, and how that like it exhausted you personally. Like that's something that I have a lot of trouble with from a social media perspective, at least, like when I'm on Twitter, Facebook, where nowadays, and this has always gone on. It's always weird to talk about this, like, oh, nowadays it's so much worse, but it is worse nowadays. So it's like a weird contrast there. But it does feel like there's certain sects of like what I would just broadly label as progressive Christianity that they've taken to social media in the age of Trump, in the age of all this political polarization, and that they've, in a lot of ways, they've really developed a critique of this day and this age and Trump and the media and all this that seems very spiteful and seems very not productive, I guess, in some capacity. And it is weird when I think about this, so I just want to hear what your thoughts on it, because when I think about it, you mentioned before how, you know, with your podcast, what you do, you want to make sure you're a place for being constructing. Like, you want to construct something, but you still know that there's a space for the deconstructing. So we both know that there's a time and a place, and that there's people. It's weird even talking about this in phases, because there's certain people that I know, and I'm sure you know, that they got hurt or abused in some capacity by the church, and that they are maybe 20, 30, 40 years into that, and they're still not past it. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's that sort of tendency for people like you and I, like we can see like abstractly abuse, and we can maybe say like, oh, we've been hurt or neglected or rejected, but we don't have a full empathetic understanding of what it is to be abused on like certain levels. So, you know, there's certain people who have been hurt in a way that they aren't coming back. Like, they're not getting to this, like, it's not like a journey for them. Like some people, like we like to talk about it. Like, everything's a journey, everything's phases of life. So I'm interested to know, like, a little bit of your thoughts on it. Like, I'm always caught in that tension between thinking about when I see certain people espousing this more spiteful, hateful rhetoric, I get irritated. Like, it brushes up against me, and I think that's wrong. Why are they doing that? That's not productive. That's ridiculous, and it makes me feel like, oh, like I've been saying, you're becoming the thing you hate. This is not a good overall thing to become. But then on the other hand, I think about, you know, where are they in their life, and like what brought them to be in that position. And in a lot of cases, when you do get to know them and talk to them, you find out what has happened to them. So, like, what are some of your thoughts on like navigating how people perceive and understand social criticism when it becomes something that looks a lot like the thing that was left on the other side? And yeah, just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you could be a fundamentalist progressive as well.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally, I would say funny.
Good one.
I just think that for me, judging, I just don't have a lot of energy anymore for judging other people's journeys. Mm. Like, I have enough to take responsibility for my own existence. Yeah. And so that's the first thing, is like you mentioned, being irritated by that. And I think I still experience that sometimes, but then I'm like, that's their story. Why do I feel like it's my job to like police everyone? Yeah. And make these universal, absolute pronouncements of what we should or shouldn't do. So I like to say I try not to should on people. Like, so it's letting it, yeah. It's the difference of locality and particularity. Like, we can make general statements, that's fine, but I don't know how useful that is. And it's like locality, meaning these people who are saying a lot of these things, I don't know them. I don't know their story. So I'm wasting a lot of energy when a 5-minute conversation might diffuse a lot of that. But I just don't have the capacity to have 5-minute conversations with everyone. Exactly. So like I feel like shrink my world, and I feel like a lot. There's this like trauma fatigue, or I hear some progressive friends of mine like talk about this fatigue of being on social media. I'm like, Yeah, it's because you're taking responsibility for things that you as an individual human being were like not built to try to take responsibility for.
Yes.
And so, and then they can like shame you. Like, you know, my wife isn't on Facebook because she doesn't want to read the news every day and have all the bad things happening like right in front of her face every day.
Yeah.
And some people are like, well, it's your responsibility to know.
Yeah, like she's privileged. Like she doesn't have to deal with that.
Yeah, and I get that. It's just, maybe it is, but it is her journey. Like, I don't think shaming people for that's going to necessarily work. So anyway, for me, it's like do the good I can in the space I'm in and know the people I can know. And if I feel like a friend of mine is stuck and I feel like as a friend, it's my responsibility to say, dude, you're like self-destructing here because you can't move past this. Like go to a therapist to like figure this out. I would take that responsibility because they're my friend and I know them. But I'm not going to take that responsibility for 1,000 people on Twitter.
Yes.
It's just it's overwhelming. And is it privileged? I kind of don't care. I'm just like saying that's my capacity.
Yeah.
You can do with it what you want.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's definitely the toxic environment of social media that just makes all of this it highlights all of it so much and it makes so much of it just unmanageable when it comes to those day-to-day capacities that we have to love and engage with like topics of interest. Like from working on social media, I'm on it all day long. So I mean, I know at this point now where like there's those waves of like you have to find the time to get off and you have to really, and if you don't do that, like if there's periods of time where I'm just straight up neglectful of my own mental health, you reap the repercussions of what it is. So it's like there's certain people that I follow online who have built like in this new age of social media and like the post 2016 election, people have built entire careers off of, you know, pushing a certain political rhetoric on social media, which is insane to think about. So much of their livelihood and their identity and who they are and what they believe is wrapped up in tweeting 24 hours a day about the news cycle. And it's so difficult for me to like like you said, like to step into that and say something because I want to judge it. I want to say this can't be healthy. I want to say this is wrong. This is not good. But you can't. It's so difficult to have to separate the two because it feels oftentimes inseparable. It often feels that the person I am on social media is the person I'm in real life. These are just my thoughts. I'm putting my thoughts from my brain, the ether, whatever, onto like my profile here. So it's not that they're two separate things. I always hate when people say, "Oh, well, that's like not you. It's not the real you." It's the real you for sure. But it's this weird thing that you get swept away. Like it's easy. It's like a wave that comes in. You lose so many of the contexts that involve like just you and I sitting here face to face. Like that gets completely lost. And when it's not. And I think people brush over it when you say something like that, and they say, "Oh, of course it's face to face, like that's lost." It's that, but it's that times 10,000 every day. So it's not just like, "Oh, you're losing face to face with one person." Like you're losing it with everything. You're losing it with the earthquake that just happened in California. Like you're losing it with the genocide that just happened over here. Like you're losing it in every context. And when that's every single day that you're in this new world, like you don't know how to manage, I think, your day-to-day relationships as well, you know, because it becomes then you take that truth of like what you're used to dealing with in a certain topic or whatever it might be, and then you translate that into the people you know in real life. Like there's been multiple people I've known the past few years that have stopped talking to me or talk to me significantly less now that social media is so in our faces every day because things get highlighted that they can say like, "Oh, now I can box you in here and check you out there." And it's such like a strange, and then you see them in person and it's like everything's normal. Everything's like, "Oh, hey, how you doing? What's going on? Like how have you been?" And it's like it never even gets brought up in the real life conversation. You're like, wait, this is something you tweet about this every day or you post on Facebook about this every day. Now we have this face-to-face opportunity. Don't you want to talk about it? Like
Yeah, you know, it's funny you say that. You know, you mentioned earlier that it's like so much worse now, but I think it's just that we don't know how to handle people's true selves.
Yeah.
Like for a long time, we didn't have a mechanism to just like be so transparent. I think people still had really strong feelings and emotions, but socially, we all just didn't engage that. There's probably a lot of factors for that. But I'm just thinking like 100 years ago, people were still probably really opinionated about things. there's just no like amplification or way to be so transparent. You just didn't sit down at dinner and start like spouting off like all these things, but it was still you.
Yeah.
And so that I just think we one thing I would hope is we have a better way of handling the nuance of human beings. Like that I am not, one thing is to not sort of label like our identities are much more fluid than I think we recognize. But secondly, like we're not that good.
Yeah.
As a species. So we have this idea of like human beings and what it means to be a good human being. And if somebody tweets 3 or 4 things that doesn't line up to that, we like write them off. And I find that to be, not to be too Jesus-y, but I find that really hypocritical. Like we're all kind of, I mean, I have like my progressive friends saying, no, some things are worse than others. And I get that.
Yeah.
But I'm talking just more like common grace with people of just like, okay, yeah, that's fine. I'm not going to like cut you out of my life or be overly angry about that.
Right.
I think exploring that anger that people have when someone doesn't agree with you is important, because I think it says a lot about us. Like, what's triggering that? Why am I so angry that you are spouting off these other things?
Right.
And I think there's something there.
Yeah, oftentimes it's projecting. At least for myself, I had a conversation the other week with this philosopher. You might know who he is. His name's Massimo Pilucci. He's an Italian-born. He's a professor now at University College in New York. Super fascinating guy. He's big into Stoicism.
Oh,
so we were talking a lot about that, and this is like one of the common themes that we kept going back to, which is just this notion that a lot of what enrages us or makes us emotional comes from something that we've experienced or done ourselves or feel that we're capable of doing. Like there's so many times that I often like there was this kid, he was like 23 apparently. This happened last week in the news. Did you read this whole story about the Z Burger, where this kid, his agency, I forget what it was even called. He had an ad agency, 23-year-old, ran social media for this company called Z Burger, and he basically tweeted out this, from the company's page, this Z Burger company, tweeted out this horrific meme. And the meme was of ISIS beheading the journalist James Foley. Did you see this?
I vaguely recall that.
It was in national news. But you know how that is. It's like kind of like on the sidebar of like everything else going on a day-to-day basis. So anyway, this whole thing blew up, and this kid came out, like apologized, was like, "Oh my gosh, like I have no idea who on my staff did." Like it was the social media manager I just hired, and he kind of had like the whole story. Like a lot of it didn't really make sense, and there was definitely some lies and some sort of company cover-ups. Like he was trying to paint it a certain way to like cover his ass and all that. So it was really hard to judge the story based on the information that you were given, because none of it really seemed. Then he did this like 3-part video series on his Twitter where he was apologizing, and like it was 6 minutes, and 5 minutes of it was like self-promotional. So it was really like kind of just cringy, and like he got ripped in the comments, and people and he seems like a lot of like what he was putting out there, it seemed like he was trying to be genuine. It seemed like he was a very passionate, excitable, extroverted type of guy who was just like, I made a mistake, I'm going to be better for it, my company's going to be better for it. Like he made a lot of it focused on himself and like his own company journey rather than like the trauma and the mistake itself, which was awful. So rightfully he got all that heat, and I got livid when I saw this, and I was freaking out, and I was writing comments about it, and I made some posts about it. I actually went back and deleted 2 of the posts I made, because like an hour or 2 later, I realized like how much of like they came out of rage, like in the moment. And then I started to like extrapolate from that and realize my personality, like who I am, would at one point, like and even still maybe in the future, but like especially I can say like a few years ago at one point, would have been more than capable of coming out with the exact same type of statement. Like as I started to think about this more, I was like, I used to think like that. This kid's 23, and he's not like a kid. Obviously, he made a mistake, and he's an adult, and he has to take responsibility. But the way he was like pushing this apology, like the whole thing was so about him, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, wow, like that's actually something I'm entirely capable of. And it really triggered me. And it made me realize like that's probably why.
Yeah.
There was something to do with it, at least. You know, like obviously it was wrong, so there's like that part of it too. But that's definitely like the driving, the engine underneath it.
But when you say that, you say it's wrong, and that's how that did that. I'm thinking of, there's a philosopher, Simon Critchley, who has a book called Infinitely Demanding. And it's this ethical framework, basically, of understanding that things out in the world just emotionally prompt different things in us. And, like, understanding the nuance there, that basically maybe a lot of our ethics comes from when you're presented with a situation, you have an emotional response that in that moment creates a demand on you. You feel a demand to respond in some way, where if that situation was presented to me, I would not feel the demand. It wouldn't demand my attention. And that the thing I would then naturally not want to just take responsibility for. Yeah. And so understanding that, like, yeah, it was wrong. But you can say that in an abstract sense, but what is an appropriate emotional response to those things? Yeah. And I think sometimes we just like have like outrage culture, and it gets personal too. Like with my wife, we had to walk through this where something would happen and I wouldn't get really flustered about it. And she translated that as I didn't care. Like even like one of my kids getting hurt, she's like flipping out. And I'm like, okay, what are we going to do? Like, how do we take care of this? And then she was so angry that I didn't care. It's like, well, no, I care by getting into like fix-it mode. Right. And I get into just like crisis. I will handle this. We'll walk through it. We'll do that. And then later I'll emote and do all that.
Totally different responses.
Yeah, it's a different response. Yeah. And so we just have to be careful, I think, that we don't label ethical or unethical certain emotional reactions to things. Right. So I think that's important.
I get into that with my fiance too over the topic of veganism as a whole. 'Cause she's a vegan and she's hyperly emotionally tied to the ideology. So it's not just like there's certain people. There's certain people that I know who are vegans who are just practical, ethical vegans in the sense that they know it's, it helps the environment. It's better for like just the broader like betterment of living creatures and all that. So like there's this sort of pragmatic view of that ideology, whereas hers it's very close to home. So it's both. Obviously,
right.
It's not
that's
like
right.
it's not like she doesn't care. Like it's not like that's an abstraction to her. But when it comes to like even the smallest ways of making that difference, whereas for me, I'm much more pragmatic. So I'm like, I call myself a fleegan, where like I eat a majority vegan diet with her, but I'm not as like just tied to like the absolutism of it. Like if I'm at my family's house and my dad makes something, like I'm gonna eat it probably. And that, you know what I mean? It's like, and not every time. Like it's just kind of like I balance that in my head. Like what am I? I'm kind of dealing in that tension all the time. But needless to say, it's more pragmatic for me. It's not as like when I see a steak or when I see a piece of chicken, it doesn't do the same thing to my brain that it does to her brain on impact, which really I kind of want to hear your thoughts on this. Like I don't want to like get us in any trouble, like but I kind of do. But I want to hear your thoughts on like just how we use the word privilege and how people like navigate the usage of that word, because I think a lot of what you just hit on there kind of ties back to that, where there's certain senses of, okay, so like intersectionality is a big one right now. Like there's competing areas of social justice where there's one category, so like say we need to focus on black rights in the institutional systems that we have right now. And there's women's rights, and there's trans, like the list goes on and on. We go to veganism, it's literally an endless list of different groups of people, whether it's their race, their gender, their ideology, and they each come from a different framework, whether that's where they were born, whether they were born in an inner city area, or maybe they were born in an area where there was just immense poverty and like there's like, what do you call like an old coal mining town? You know what I mean? So like depending on where you're born and the framework you're given and the people that you grow up around, like you're going to have these different issues that touch your heart and that really hit home. So when we use the term privilege, and how like it can be used either to weaponize when someone says check your privilege, which sort of dismisses the other person's viewpoints based on those biases. But then we can also use it in the sense to say, like you just mentioned with your wife a little earlier when I brought that up and I said, well, they would say your wife is privileged, and you said, well, maybe she is. And I think that's an important way of using it in this context as well, because we can say, I have privileges ABC. We can be honest with ourselves about those things going into a conversation, and then that's the conversation can evolve from there. So like, how do you, when talking about moral outrage, like when talking about like a specific thing, how do you navigate the usage of that word? Huge question, I know.
Man, you went like, there's a lot of questions in there. I think within privilege itself, I would just, for me, I would recognize that. Like with my wife, I mean, I recognize I have a tremendous privilege in so many different ways. I think the more interesting conversation is that, okay, what do we do? What do we do with it?
Exactly.
And so I think there's a lot. I'm just thinking of some friends of mine that I have that would be African American or gay, and just like, I think that goes a long way of just like, hey, I get it. Like, yeah, I'm privileged. I have not experienced the world the way you've experienced the world. Like, what can I do? What can I do with that? Like, I think of like few different approaches. What are ways in which I can, if my lowering my privilege actually increases your opportunity, what's a good way of doing that? Yeah. Or if my privilege could be used in a way to platform or bring awareness to other things, how might that work? So I think those are good approaches for that. It's just, I don't know what else to say about privilege, and I don't actually know what the debates really. I don't know why we're so angry about some of that stuff.
I think it's because it gets weaponized. I think that's how people feel. Like, we're talking about the other in this situation. That's why it kind of gets sticky, which is why I'm interested in more solution-based ideas. Because I think the acknowledgement in what you just said, if you were to frame exactly what you just said with different language, I think you'd have almost total agreement on the other side of this debate. You know what I mean? Like, if you were just to say, like, oh, I don't understand your experience, I will never understand where you're coming from in all these ways, I think it's the way that the word privilege is used. It comes off in this weaponized rhetoric that makes certain people feel, from the privileged class primarily, it makes them feel that they don't have a voice and that they can't partake in these conversations. So that's what's interesting to me. It's because I get...
Or I would say, too, the only thing I would say is it also invalidates their struggles.
Exactly.
And I think that's really painful for like the working class to say, you're privileged because you're white. And then they look at their life and say that, in my mind, does not mean I'm... it's been hard. Yeah. And my family was poor. And I think that was a lot of that. You mentioned the coal mining towns, and that's like... There's definitely a strong narrative of like, how dare you call me privileged? But I agree, because I think it's just a misunderstanding of what we mean.
Yeah, it's like pushing the rhetoric. Because I feel like I think about this with my dad all the time as an example, because my dad's a pretty staunch conservative. In his perspective of how he would put his views out there, he's not party line as much as he used to be. He's much more rogue sort of in that sphere of beliefs. But his entire life growing up, he grew up poor parents, got into a bad scene through his teen years, and built his own company through his own means, even with a bad record and all that. So I can expand on any of that at a different time, but he had his own set of struggles to where he is. So when he hears someone like him hears that type of language, it's exactly what you just said. It's the exact same thing, where it's like, it feels like, how dare you? Like, I've worked so hard my entire life to get what I have. So it becomes such a strange thing moving forward, because I really feel like that word is one of the like wrenches being thrown in the spokes of the bike right now that is really disabling sort of the intersection between different parties being able to communicate these basic ideas. Like that basic idea that you just said about not understanding the other, it seems so basic. Like, how are we not able to do that? But I think it's because we've just weaponized the rhetoric in a way that makes it really...
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it's the thing, just to kind of caveat it for my progressive friends, and I do understand, of course, that it's punching up, that it's like they're using it in a way that, of course, they're not trying to be nice. They're not trying to be understanding. Like, there's that whole angle of it that I do try to get, because I do have a privilege in a way where I won't understand why certain people feel the need to weaponize it. So just in saying that, I'm trying to understand that better, but go ahead.
Well, and I think that's a good point. I forgot what I was going to say a minute ago, but I would say, for me, it's just practical. Like, I want to support, like, what's the end game here? And then what's the best, most strategic way of doing that? And I think that's important. And I think for some people that can be dismissive And I get into trouble with that sometimes because, like, I'll say things like, and I've learned I don't say this as much, but someone's like ranting about something, and I'm like, what? Again, it comes back to like, what's the goal of this communicative act? Because if the goal is to persuade someone, I'm just letting you know it's probably not going to work. Like, that's just not a good approach. If it's to emote because you feel an injustice has been done and you feel emotional about it, okay, that's fine. I'm just pointing out that if that was what you're trying to do, it's probably not going to work.
Right.
But, by all means, do what you need to do. So, I remember what I was going to say. When it comes to this privilege thing, too, it comes back to the idea of probabilities. And I've just seen a lot of, when I look at kind of ping pong my conservative friends and my more progressive friends, it's like, a lot of times my progressive friends are making systematic arguments, and then my conservative friends are anecdotally dismantling
personal
the system. Personal
experience
versus systems. And I think that's, I wouldn't put it at all left or right. I just think some people, and I wouldn't make the distinction, it's not by lines or anything, but some people just think more that way. They think more particulars and anecdotes and experience, and some people think large swaths of data and systems and percentages and that sort of thing.
And you can swap it totally when it comes to police violence, or like the topic of police brutality and all of that. Like it becomes much more anecdotal on like the generally speaking on the left side of the spectrum, whereas on the right there's like, well, look at the data. So there's a lot
it's funny
of that.
How it goes.
Yeah,
it can
depending on the issue.
It can, But I think that's really important because sometimes again they think that they're like dismantling each other's arguments, but they're actually on a different plane.
Yeah,
like. Okay, I'm making a systematic statistical observation, and you're giving me an anecdote. Those are not mutually exclusive. Those can both be true. So, in general, white people can have this sort of privilege in educational systems, let's say, and yet you can have a story where that wasn't true.
Right.
That can both be true.
Yeah.
And I feel like that for me that's where I get frustrated, where I'm just like, you're not disagreeing, actually. You just think you're disagreeing.
I think a lot of the people in the upper echelons of media are very savvy to that. So I think they understand then if they can find those exceptions, if they can find the case of like the disenfranchised white person in this neighborhood or whatever it is, it's all highlighted. People, like, depending on what your narrative is in media bias, you look for those exceptions to promote how off the
it'll
other
get
side
popular.
is. That's how you get popular. I'm interested to know, like, kind of just going off of a lot of the broader stuff that we're talking about here, like the way it's framed. You and I had this conversation last year, maybe 2 years ago. I forget when it was exactly. We were talking a little bit about the overarching topic of truth, but also in how you understand it through your evangelical framework. And I'm interested to know for people, because like I said in the beginning of this, I think a lot of people, when they hear words like God, religion, etc., they kind of check themselves at the door. Whereas I'm interested to know why do you maintain that framework? And can you get into how you see yourself from the outside looking in, I guess, when it comes to like what you believe and how you live in that community?
Yeah, I don't want to get too abstract, but I think it's helpful to say I think that we all play language games, which is, if in philosophy, it's like a technical term. It's not just like saying we're playing games with our language. Mm-hmm. It's saying that we all grow up with certain rules for how we communicate. And there's, a certain language that we then, I think of it like a skin, right? Or like a phone case, right? So the reality is kind of like the phone, and then we all put like different cases on it. And I would call that like a language game. And so we all don't have a choice. We're all embodied people, cultured people in certain contexts. We all have a language that we use to talk about these, that we're trying to palpate toward these fundamental realities that we, language in that sense kind of gets in the way. Like we fumble over it because we can't get beyond it, right? So Derrida will say things like, there's nothing outside the text. And all he means by that is no matter how much you want to get to reality, you always have to filter through language. Yeah. It's just how we're built. And that can be frustrating. But the opportunity then is we can pick the language game. Like what are we going to use to communicate about reality? And for me, it's convenient and easy and important and helpful and rooted and grounded and traditional for me to use Christian language. And I think that's really important. And there's a deep truth to that. So that's why that's the language game that I understand reality through. Yeah.
I think some people, I know you're just off the bat of that. I know you would never say, just judging by what I know of you, I know you wouldn't say that that's required for anyone else. You're not trying to push that that structure, that this way that you view the structure that you live within on anybody else. But I think people are interested in that, in the sense that, you know, what are, like, when you look at the broader topic of, like, secularism versus religion, that's one of the things that it always comes down to. It's like the sort of evangelizing of ideas. Like, people are always interested in, do we want society to move forward in a more secular way, a more scientifically minded, or in some people, scientism, that's like what they kind of lean toward, you know? So people are looking for, like, the different ways we ought to move culture forward. So I think, like, what are some of, in your mind, like, the most innate values within the Christian tradition, particularly, that for anyone on the outside, to help them to understand why you would choose to, like, stay in the label? Because it makes sense communally. It makes sense, okay, you grew up in this community, and it makes sense this is the religious text you were raised in, so you have a good understanding of it, which I share that with you. But I think from the outside, people often think, well, why wouldn't you just grow up and get past it? Like, why wouldn't you just, you don't need it anymore.
I mean,
right?
I think most people, though, have a very anemic and short-sighted understanding of the history of the Christian tradition. So when they grow up and move past it, like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Like, espouse most worldviews of, and I can find a Christian saint or theologian or, you know, someone in the church who's probably said the same thing.
Right.
So it just, we take, it's the same thing we've been talking about. Like, we absolutize or overgeneralize when there's just so much nuance. Like, there's infinite nuance. You know, like I was saying, there's reality, and then we always cookie cutter it to fit what we know. And I think most people, like, you know, you don't know the history of Christian theology. So what you're really saying is, why wouldn't you grow past my understanding of Christianity? And I'd say, well, maybe I have. I don't know. I don't know what your understanding of Christianity is. So.
Yeah, then it becomes semantics of, like, what do you mean by God? Like, what do you mean by Christian?
And we can go down that road forever.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, and it's fun. For me, I like it. So I just don't know what people mean when they say, like, oh, well, like, this God who interacts with, well, what do you do with the apophatic mystic fathers who were clearly in the Christian tradition, but would say, well, yeah, God doesn't interact with us. God's the great mystery, the great unknown, the being beyond being. Okay, so that is Christianity. Yeah. That's there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, like, how much of, like, within that understanding then, like, how much do stories play a part in all this? Kind of as a big theme within a lot of, like, what you talk about, a lot of what Pete talks about, where there's this sort of deep, it's almost like I don't want to say it's entirely rooted in, like, Joseph Campbell or, like, archetypal understanding. It's not entirely that, but there's definitely that feel to this understanding of religion that is heavily based on storytelling and the value of a story. So, like, how much of that ties in to, like, this belief structure?
Well, stories are nice because they're porous. And that's helpful because then we can infuse meaning over generations, right?
Yeah.
As structures change and as things change, we can change the meaning of a story.
Yeah.
Easier. I think you still can do that with didactic things and lessons learned and the other things. But stories are particularly good structure for, if you want things to last, if you want teachings to last a long time, tell it in a story because they are just naturally ambiguous.
Right.
Yeah.
I always think it's my fiance's obsessed with Harry Potter, and she follows, like, all the Harry Potter podcasts and all that. And there's one that is an actual, like, I don't know if it's actually, I think it is an official religion of Harry Potter. Have you heard of this?
Wow, no. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like a group, it's like a podcast group made this, and, like, it's called the Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, I think. And they literally
I know that podcast.
They do, like, a weekly thing where they go through the text, and it's obviously much of it's satire. It's not like it's sort of like Satanism. You know what I mean? People look at it from the outside, like, oh, that's crazy cult. Like, but really it's a lot of mischief and just fun and lightness. So it is interesting, though, because you look at stories like that, or like Lord of the Rings or whatever kind of mythological tale, and a lot of them carry that same weight as the biblical stories when you look back, because they last longer than if someone were just to write some literal, factual account of something that no one cares about. Like, if you and I were to sit here and just go through, you know, like, the factual events of the assassination of, like, John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr., like, these are things on paper, if you were just to read it, it's not that enticing. But when you actually tell the story and you have the perspectives and the biases and the enunciation and the hyperbole and all of that tied in, like really, it creates something cool for people to latch onto and want to remember.
Yeah. It makes me think of this quote. I've never actually found it, so I should probably stop attributing it to Jacques Derrida. But I've searched a few times. I'm sure it's there. But he kind of has, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't know what the actual reference is, but it's a nice concept. He says, facts are what's there if everyone dies. And like he says that in a way of saying they're not that interesting. Like that's what you get if every human died.
Yeah.
That would be, reality's still there. There's the facts. That's just not that interesting. So stories are a human thing.
Yeah.
And that makes it interesting. So we tend to like hyper elevate facts as like the most important thing. And I appreciate that quote because it's sort of like dethroning that. Like, okay, facts are good, but maybe they're a tool for something else rather than just the end in itself.
Well, that's a huge pop culture debate that's been happening recently. Like, I remember, like, it was like a year ago or so, following semi-closely. I'm very critical to even mention these two because in following them, I try to stay critical of their public presence. But Sam Harris had done a debate with Jordan Peterson, which wasn't meant to be a debate. It just kind of stirred, like, internet fumes from, like, this whole what is truth type of thing, whereas Jordan Peterson, for anyone listening who doesn't know, which you probably know at this point, like he's very notorious in a Canadian psychologist who's gone viral the past couple of years, but a lot of what he didn't necessarily go viral for that is like an undertone to a lot of what he believes is like heavily based in mythology and using storytelling and Jungian archetypes to explain reality, and a lot of like dark, like it's like a combination of that and like the Darwinian like evolutionary model, just like truth is what furthers human existence and the benefits of evolution and all that. So needless to say, that was sort of the perspective he was arguing, whereas Sam Harris was arguing the more of that, like the more epistemological, like this is the facts of like what reality, like what we can call truth. So it's interesting how like that's not something. Personally, I'm similar to you in interest. You're more obviously a professional in this field. I'm more just, this is interesting to me. I can talk about what truth is and what reality is and all that, but it's not something, generally speaking, that people would have ever given two shits about a few years ago. But now that you have public figures talking more and more about these things, you see it and how it actually influences like the debate between different political parties and ideologies. So I'm interested to know like how... Like when you're writing this book right now on truth, what is like your starting point when you're explaining what truth is and like how do you extrapolate that within your work?
Well, it's funny because it ties right in with what we've just been talking about, and that is my fundamental thesis is we just mean different things when we use the word truth. Just like I think Sam Harris is using it in a different way than Jordan Peterson's using it. And then they're just going after each other, trying to compete over different definitions, which seems not that fruitful.
Yeah, it's like, a big waste of time.
It seems like you could just say, yeah, you're both true in a lot of ways, and like you're both right in some ways. And so what we're dealing with, and I was listening to this the other day because I'm a big nerd, so I listen to like analytic philosophy and different things in my car. And just the history, I was listening to kind of the history of truth in philosophy particularly, and just like these mathematicians find, like Bertrand Russell and these guys, they get so fed up and they just say like, if we want to know what things are, we actually have to stop using English. And so they get, the analytic philosophy uses symbolism, like symbolic logic, where now they're like taking English or language in that sense, the syntax and the grammar of a particular language, they call it like the common tongue or whatever, and then they have this like abstract language that they have to use to do these mathematical, logical things with arguments, because language is sloppy. That's what makes it beautiful.
Yeah.
Is it's messy, and you can use words with multivalences. Like you can use words that have multiple meanings, like truth, and that's great for society and culture and meaning and a robustness and all these things. It makes the plays on words. It's like what makes hip hop great and these things. The problem is if we're trying to get specific and accurate about what we mean by things, it's terrible.
Yeah.
So all that to say is I think we just have to come to a common understanding of saying, well, when you use truth this way, you mean it in that way, and when I use truth. So that's kind of, for me, the thesis of the book at root is saying, are there at least a few of these we can pick out and say these are probably the most from a popular level, this is the most popular ways we use truth. And if we could just at least, and I'll tie it to the Bible, of course. It'll be more specific, I think, around the Bible. When we're talking about, like, is the Bible true? Well, first, can we just, like, talk about these three different meanings so you don't become ships passing in the night, just like we were talking about with privilege or whatever it is.
So what are the three different meanings? Do you want to get into that, or do you want to save that for your book?
So, no, I already did a podcast on it.
Okay, cool.
So it's truth as fact. So it's the Sam Harris. Maybe I'll use that. It's the Sam Harris model.
Yeah.
And then truth as meaning, which is more of the Jordan Peterson, I think, model. And then I end by talking about truth as wisdom, which I think is different because I think the Bible points to this. I think a lot of religious traditions do. And it's hard because it's the only one that's not a noun, it's an adverb. So it's not truth as any sort of mental assent or fact or state of affairs. It's living truthfully. It's an adverb. And I think the Bible actually is much more interested in truth as wisdom, pushing toward John does this a lot. 1 John in the Gospel of John, but I think 1 John 4 or something like that. He says, or 3 John 4, something like that, says, "This is my greatest desire for you is that you walk in the truth." So it's that walking in truth. Like, what does that mean? Like, that's a metaphor is what that is, and that's awkward and ambiguous. Like, walking in truth. What does that mean? But the idea is this adverb. Like, are we living truthfully?
Yeah.
And so that's where I would put, like, truth as fact is a tool. Truth as meaning is a tool toward this truth as wisdom, toward a life of truthfulness. And so it's not that those are bad or wrong or anything like that. It's just a matter of a certain worldview. And I think Christianity is one where it would kind of dethrone those first two and say, it's great, but those are means to a bigger end here.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I want to open up an entire can of worms as we're winding down. I'm just trying to think of, like, for anyone listening on the outside of a lot of this, you know, like, in how you use those definitions then to interpret, say, the Bible.
Right.
Like, how would you, like, just give some, like, really basic examples, like, between, like factual, metaphorical, like, kind of going through it. Because that's one of the, it seems really basic to anyone who's, I shouldn't say anyone, but to most people who have deconstructed the religious whatever upbringing they had in some capacity. But I think for a lot of people, they get stuck on that literalist angle where they think, like, oh, like all Christians think, you know, these things in the Old Testament, they had to have happened literally, and that Christians believe it and endorse it. So, like, can you kind of get into just a couple, like, basic usages of it? Yeah.
So the Bible, you know, if it's talking about truth as fact, so we ask the question, is the Bible true? And, well, what do we mean by that? Well, one thing we mean is it factual? Is it factual? And we say yes and no. Right? Like, the Bible has some really true facts in it, and the Bible has some not true facts in it. Then you ask the question, well, was it intending to have it be true facts, or was it not intending to have it be true facts? And the answer is yes and no for all of this. Like, it's just that, you know, the book isn't a monolithic thing. Right. So when we say, is it factual, you take Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Those are easy examples. You say, is that factual? Well, no, that's not factual. Was Genesis intending it to be factual? Yeah, probably, in some sense, right? So I just think that's how the ancient world would have conceived of the world. They would have basically thought it was a snow globe with a metal dome, like a snow globe.
Firmament.
Yeah, the firmament, the rakia, which it's funny, look that word up in like 7 different translations, you're going to get 7 different words because people are like, what the heck is that thing? Yeah. Well, it's a metal dome that you basically, Genesis paints the world as a snow globe dunked in a 55-gallon barrel of water. So there's waters above, there's waters below, and then God created the rakia to separate the waters above from the waters below so that we could actually have a habitable space. And then he moved all that water to one side so that we had oceans and dry land. So that's how the ancients would have conceived of reality, of fact-based, observable, empirical reality. That's how they thought it happened. So when we ask the question, is the Bible true, and we're talking about facts, we have to have that conversation. Like, okay, well, let's weigh it against what we kind of know in the scientific community, and how does that square up, and was the Bible right about that? Was it wrong about that? And was it trying to be right, or was it not? And then we have the Bible as meaning, which would be always a two-way street. So is it true is a question of, oftentimes we mean, is it meaningful? And that's a what dare I say, that's a personal, it's a much more nuanced personal understanding of what we mean by true. So we can say, do I get meaning out of reading Genesis 1-3? Is it true to me in that sense? Is it true for us as a culture? Is it true for this community? Yeah, like there's a lot there. And I think maybe like a Jordan Peterson would like unpack that kind of stuff. And so it's like, it can be not factual, but true in the meaning sense of that term. And, you know, Jonah is a great example of that, where it's like a lot of people who think the Bible has to be factual about everything kind of write off, well, Jonah, like I get people who think that like the moral of Jonah is like, oh my gosh, God kept someone alive in the belly of a fish. That's like the moral of the story when you kind of read it in that fact-based way. But when you think about, is the Bible true, and what are the meanings that it can have for us? And you start to see maybe Jonah wasn't even intended to be factual story.
Yeah.
It is a parable in that sense, and lots of signs point to that. Then we have to ask, okay, what's the meaning? Okay, it's a commentary on how we respond when God is gracious to our enemies. And what does that do? It creates a lot of problems, and it creates a lot of conversations, and it creates that's a very deeply meaningful thing.
Yeah.
So it's true in that sense. And then the last one would be, again, truth as wisdom would be this kind of John thing of, are my children walking in the truth? And that's a question that actually jumps out of the text. It connects our life with the text, because you can't answer that question with words, and you can't answer that question in the text. And John actually points to that, I think in 1 John 4:8, he says, let's not love each other by talking. Let's love each other in how we act. And that's kind of that point. So he actually says, let's love each other in deeds and in truth. In truth. And so what I want to do is basically say, I think the Bible is critiquing our obsession with facts and meaning, and it's pointing us toward this. Hey, guys, okay, that's great that you're like arguing about facts on your computer all day, but are you walking in the truth?
Right. Yeah.
And so it's the better question is, for me in the book, not is the Bible true, but are you living a life of truth?
Right.
I think that's a better question.
Yeah, because a lot of people can use like the Bible then as a weapon for
that's right.
For exactly, yeah. So it depends what it is too. Like you can look at other mythologies and stories, like say Lord of the Rings as an example. If someone's watching that film, you're going to go into it maybe attaching in the metaphorical, meaningful sense. Maybe you'll attach to a certain character a certain way, so you'll get that reality as you go through that character's story arc of the whole series. You'll get that aspect of it, and then you'll also bring to it whatever biases you already have to the story. So then how that affects you and how you, like, I guess, add that into whatever truthful way you're living. Like those are two completely different things. And then, of course, if that's in that case, we already know that's a fictional story, so you don't have to worry about the factional. Yeah. But yeah, there's like different. It's interesting to extrapolate the different meanings in a real life context when you go through it.
And I think the main thing I would say is, it's a fundamental truth that helped me, or a realization, was meaning is always a two-way street. Things don't mean anything, right? In themselves, things don't mean anything.
Yeah.
It's a meaning. All we mean is it's a relationship.
Yeah.
And so facts can, again, be true whether we're all here or not, right? Kind of Derrida's point. But meaning is always a two-way street.
Yeah, we're projecting it onto whatever the thing is that we're deriving meaning from.
Yeah, so when I say, what does this mean? What I'm really saying is, this means this to me. Does it mean the same to you?
Yeah.
And if we both say, yeah, it means the same, then we can say this is what it means in our language game when you and I are talking. But if you bring three more people in, they say, no, that doesn't mean that.
It's going to be super complicated. Because we're all going to have different meanings for the word.
That's right.
So let's close on this, and I'll word it this way. Why do you think people are so interested and feel such a need for explanation generally? Like, why do we need these things to be explained at such a deep level? Like, why do you feel this way personally?
I don't know.
Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. No, why? I mean, we're meaning-making machines, I think, as humans. And so give us more data, and we'll try to make more meaning. I think that's so it's more like a biological response.
Do you think it's more evolutionary?
Yeah,
in the
I
sense
think so.
We just crave it.
Yeah, we make meaning. That's what we do. We take chaos and we order it. And so the more chaos we see, the more we want to order it. And So I think it's just part of who we are. We just have so much more content. And we're our brains are trying to keep up with just an explosion of content that we're not really able to handle.
Yeah.
And so we're just like, we're trying to file stuff away like a mile a minute because we're just getting so much input. And then we're trying to make sense of it. And we're trying to put it into coherent theories. And I think, evolutionary biologists would say, because that helps us like survive when we can control our environment and make it mean things and do that sort of thing. So I think it's a survival mechanism. And I think we're not equipped to handle this level of content in that way. And I think it's scary. And I think that just reinforces it. Whenever we just feel out of control and overwhelmed, like we just want to control it more.
Right.
So
I'm actually going to end on this then, because like you just sparked one last piece. I think then, do you believe that the most healthy way of being is to live in that tension of constantly wrestling with, trying to explain and find meaning and balance that with just reality? Or do you feel, because I feel like for most people it's a safe bet to just settle in to whatever they believe, and they don't have to think about it, like we were saying earlier in the conversation. Like a lot of these notions of truth, God, certain political affiliations, whatever, they're abstract in the back of their minds. They're settled in, so they're not acknowledging whatever like neuroplasticity their brain might have, and they're just going forward with life as if this is who I am. I am this person forever. That's the way. So, like, and I feel like for some people, maybe that feels like the healthy way to be, because it's like, it gives you structure. So, like, do you feel long term, and since we've been speaking in probability, it's like obviously you can't make a blanket statement, but from the probability sense, do you think that tension is the best way to live?
Well, I would be very hesitant to talk about how we ought to live. Nietzsche has this great analogy where he says different body types require different diets. So why would we prescribe the same moral framework to everyone?
There you go.
And so we just are built differently. I think there are some people for whom that is probably the healthiest thing for them. Like, they're not built to think complex thoughts or abstractly, and they're not even wired to desire that or have a drive for that. And so for me to problematize that for them feels like I'm doing violence to them.
Right.
And so it's, again, connection. Like, can I get to know someone and see what motivates them and where their drive is? Are they stuck or are they happy? I think that's really not to project my own understanding onto them.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not stuck. Maybe they're perfect. I mean, they're fine. They're happy. So again, it's that nuanced understanding of, I think there are maybe different types of people, whether you're like Enneagram, you got 9 types or 27. I don't care. I think there's a finite number. I don't know what it is. Yeah. Of different types who have different motivations and different needs. And I can't prescribe anything for you until I know that. Like, just like a doctor physically wouldn't be like, oh yeah, I've never seen you, but I'll just, based on my physical type, I think you should get on this type 2 diabetes medication.
Right.
It makes no sense. And I think morally, we just get into trouble when we don't realize that it's the same for people. So yeah, I would problematize it and say each of us have to kind of figure that out for ourselves. For me, I love challenge. I love tension. I'm always going to be curious. I'm always going to be driven to like know more things and I'm just who I am. So my question is, how can I do that in the healthiest way? Not whether that's okay or not.
Yeah. What a nuanced answer to end this. So, I mean, I'll plug, like, your info, like, what you're doing, and the podcast and all that, but do you got anything specifically going on that you want to point people toward, or places to follow you or anything?
Just I like to have conversations on Facebook, so I have an author page there, and Twitter, Byas on Twitter. So I appreciate the conversations. I appreciate the feedback, so would appreciate some follows there. And then, the podcast and book won't be coming out for, I don't know, a year and a half. So
that's all those things are.
Yeah, it'll take forever.
You never know.
So
cool, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.